Radio Philippines Network, DXKT 1071 sa inyong mga radyo, ang Radyo Ronda sa Davao.
RPN Radio Philippines Network, Radyo Ronda, DXKT Davao. Member, kapisanan ng mga broadcaster
Today's
ng
episode features Dr. Jake.
That time check was brought to you by ACS Manufacturing Corporation, ISO certified world-class quality.
The views expressed by the host do not necessarily state or reflect those of RPN and its management. Furthermore, the views and opinions expressed by the guest do not reflect those of the host, the program, the management, and RPN.
Hebert, physicist and research associate with the Institute for Creation Research. Here's Dr. Hebert.
During this episode of Science, Scripture, and Salvation, I thought I would tell you a little bit about my own personal creation journey. I was converted at a young age. I was 7 years old at the time, and really kind of out of the blue, I just wondered how I could be sure that I was going to heaven, and that seemed like a very important thing to know. And so I asked my father about it, who had recently been converted, and he explained the gospel to me, and I became a Christian, a young believer at that time. That was the first step, obviously, in my spiritual journey. And it was obvious to me that the Lord was working in my life at that young age because, as I said, this was just out of the blue. One day, all of a sudden, I just started wondering how I could know the answer to that question. I started to grow spiritually and also physically and intellectually. I had a fifth grade teacher who did a lot to fuel my interest in science. I've had many good teachers over the years, great teachers, in fact. But this particular teacher, she did a lot to encourage my interest in science. She even got me a really nice packet of materials from NASA that had all these beautiful glossy photographs of objects in space and posters and things like that. And that was really neat. And so this helped to sort of fuel my interest in science. I was particularly interested in astronomy and space exploration and thought about possibly being an astronaut at one point, although I quickly realized I did not have the stomach for it, literally, because I get sick on amusement park rides, so that was pretty much out of the question. And I thought, well, maybe I could be an astronomer, and my parents got me a telescope, but the only object I could find in the sky with it was the moon. This was back in the old days when you didn't have the fancy motorized equipment on most telescopes, so I was a little bit inept with trying to find objects in the sky. But it was nice, and so I continued to enjoy this field. Around the time I got to middle school, I started having intellectual doubts about Christianity. Not even so much about creation versus evolution per se, but just more general apologetics doubts. How do I know that the things that I've been taught are true? How do I know that I haven't been led astray? And of course, the creation evolution issue was sort of in the background as well. But we had a close family friend who loaned me one of her books called Scientific Creationism, which was written by the founder of the Institute for Creation Research, Dr. Henry Morris. And that book really had a profound influence on me. It ignited my lifelong interest in this subject. And from what I've heard, that book has had a lot of influence on a lot of other people, including some of my ICR coworkers. I was in middle school at the time, so I wouldn't try to pretend that I understood everything in the book. But there was a lot in there that was just really good material. And one thing that really struck me was that the secular story they were telling about how fossils form really didn't make any sense. You know, you read the textbooks and you get the idea this animal dies and slowly over time dust or something starts to cover it up, maybe. But, you know, the problem with that is that in order for something to fossilize, it's got to be buried quickly. And that made so much sense at the time. And I thought to myself, well, why didn't I think of that? I mean, that's so obvious. The story they're telling us about how fossils form slowly over millions of years, it just doesn't make any sense. And so this began to fuel an interest in this subject. I began asking my parents for creation resource material for my birthday and for Christmas gifts. And I remember that we took a big family vacation one year when I was in the 7th grade. It was a long trip. And I remember taking some books with me to read, including Dr. Morris's The Genesis Flood and the book In Search of Noah's Ark. Some of you who've been around for a while may remember that movie that was on TV, and they had a book that went along with it. And so I had that book, and I was just gobbling all this information up. And so I was just very, very interested in this. And like I said, I continued to learn more about this subject. And by the time I got to high school, I was still sort of leaning towards science, although I felt like chemistry probably was not what I was interested in. I was frankly a little bit intimidated by the chemistry lab. I did well in chemistry class, but I was a little bit intimidated because I was afraid I was going to blow myself up or something. So I tended to lean a little bit more toward physics. In my junior year in high school, our local university, Lamar University, had a physics open house, and I had to attend that as an assignment, and it's sort of an extracurricular science assignment for one of my classes. And they were doing all kind of neat physics demonstrations and doing all this neat stuff, and it really thought was fascinating and very interesting. And that's about the time that I began to decide that I wanted to major in physics. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this in the upcoming segment.
Now it's time for a short break. We'll hear more from Dr. Hebert in a moment. Dinosaurs are fascinating creatures. Seeing their fossils inspires a sense of awe and wonder that sparks the imagination. We're learning more about them all the time, but many questions still remain. Are dinosaurs really millions of years old? Did they live at the same time as humans? How do they fit with the Bible? And why are they extinct today? The Institute for Creation Research addresses these questions and more in their full-color and easy-to-read book, Guide to Dinosaurs. Guide to Dinosaurs delves into the history of dinosaurs, fossil discoveries, dinosaur kinds, and what the Bible has to say about these mysterious creatures. It serves as a helpful resource for parents and kids alike. Order your copy of Guide to Dinosaurs from the Institute for Creation Research by calling 800-628-7640 or visiting icr.org. That's 800-628-7640 or visiting icr.org. Welcome back to Science, Scripture, and Salvation. Here's Dr. Hebert.
I've been describing my own personal creation journey in this episode. And as I said earlier, about my junior year in high school, I had begun to sort of lean toward physics as a course of study. And so I attended our university near where I grew up, Lamar University, and I got my BS in physics, did very well. And then I went to graduate school at Texas A&M, and I was having some health problems at the time, and also it was a kind of a big jump coming from a smaller school to a big school. And so I frankly struggled at the time. I'd originally wanted to get my PhD, but I really ended up just kind of having to settle for my master's degree. At the time, I really wanted a PhD very, very badly. In fact, it was kind of an idol, I think. I wanted it maybe a little too badly. And it seemed like the Lord was closing that door. And of course, what do you do when the Lord closes a door, right? Well, you try to kick it open, right? No, not really. That's not a good idea, but that's what I actually tried to do. I was even prepared to switch majors and completely start over in a different field and try to get a PhD that way, which was really kind of insane when you think about it. But that didn't work out, and so I got my master's degree. I taught both the high school and college level with varying degrees of success. But all the time I was kind of scheming to go back to graduate school. And finally, at one point, I just sort of got the sense that perhaps the Lord was not pleased, that maybe this was a little too important to me. And so I sort of said, well, Lord, if you don't want me to have a PhD, okay, I can accept that. And what was interesting is once I sort of relented on that issue, then the door started to open. People started suggesting that I should go back, which was kind of interesting. So anyway, I ended up going back. In 2007, I enrolled at the University of Texas at Dallas in the physics program and did very well there. I started working with a professor who was doing some very cutting-edge research related to a possible influence of cosmic rays on weather and climate. And people have been speculating about this for hundreds of years. But I really think that my professor has really figured some stuff out on this. He's really done some good work on this. And I think I was able to help him perhaps push the football, move it a few more yards down the field, so to speak. And so I think in retrospect, the work that I did at the University of Texas at Dallas had much more potential to be helpful to the church than anything I could have done at Texas A&M. The stuff at Texas A&M was not really related to Origins research all that much. And this wasn't either. But because it was climate weather related, it sort of allowed me to get my feet wet and start in sort of preparing the way for some of the work I'm doing right now here at the Institute for Creation Research. And so I would just like to say that working at the Institute for Creation Research is really a dream come true for me. I'm very grateful that the Lord has given me this opportunity to work here. I have been wanting to do this kind of work for many, many, many years, but it seems like it's taken me longer to get here than I would have liked. But I finally made it, and I'm just so excited and thrilled to be here and to be doing this work. There's lots of things I would like to say to the Christians out there who may be listening to this, and even perhaps people who are not Christians. It grieves me that secularism and atheism, I think, have taken much of the joy out of science. And not just science, but pretty much any branch of learning. For instance, in an astronomy class, you see all these beautiful photos of the heavenly bodies, these galaxies, and these beautiful objects that God has created, and yet you are strictly forbidden from giving any honor to the person who created those things. And as one of our ICR colleagues, Dr. Randy Galusa, has said, really, if science is done right, it should inspire in you a desire to worship God. But because of this very stringent secular attitude that is enforced so rigidly in our institutions of higher learning, you can't even talk about these things, no matter how obvious it is that something was designed. You just can't even talk about it. And I think also history. I think if we look at history, think about how much more exciting history class would have been in high school or college had you been told about all these fascinating confirmations of the biblical history, things you're just not told about in secular school. It's our hope here at ICR that the work we're doing will be an encouragement to people. And finally, I would just like to say to young people, please don't accept less than God's best for your life. Usually that's going to require a lot of work. And if you have an interest in science, I would strongly encourage you to pursue it, because we don't know how much longer this door will remain open. And so we need to redeem the time, for as Scripture says, the days are evil.
On today's show, we'll get to hear from Dr. Tim Clary, geologist and research associate with the Institute for Creation Research. Here's Dr. Clary.
Oil is in the news almost every day. Oil prices are going up or going down. A lot of questions about hydrofracking. And one of the other questions that many Christians have is, how does oil fit in with the Bible? Was oil made in the flood, or was it before the flood? We're going to look at some of these questions today. Oil is very, very important in our economy. Between oil and natural gas, it provides about 2/3 of our energy use for the whole world. So it's a very, very important commodity. With all the talk about fracking, hydrofracking today, really that has allowed us, however, to find tremendous amounts of oil that was before unavailable. And so we've almost doubled our world oil reserves in the last 10 to 15 years because of this hydrofracking. Most hydrofracking takes place deep in the ground, in the subsurface, thousands of feet down, so it really has very little effect on most of the surface waters we drink. Many of our discoveries have also come about because of increased technology. Our seismic data is better and better. We can actually see the rock layers better before we drill, and that has allowed us to find more oil as well. So between the fracking and the new discoveries from technology, we've nearly doubled our oil reserves, as I mentioned earlier. But what does the Bible say about oil? Is oil even mentioned in the Bible? If we go back to the very first appearance of oil in the Bible, it goes back to Genesis 11:3. At the Tower of Babel, then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and break them thoroughly." They had brick for stone and they had asphalt for mortar. So that word asphalt, or what's probably another translation would be oil, some sort of oil product, was used for mortar. So here we are about 200 years or so after the flood, and the Bible's talking about using some sort of oil. Unfortunately, many secular geologists, many secular scientists say that oil was around before the flood. It wasn't caused by the flood at all. David Montgomery, in his book The Rocks Don't Lie, said a literal reading of the Bible requires that rocks are already existed at the time of the flood, because bitumen, the pitch that Noah used to caulk the ark, comes from sedimentary rock. in Genesis 6:14, though, is not a hydrocarbon. This is kind of a poor English translation of the Hebrew word kopher, which starts with a K, in Genesis 6:14. Kopher sheathed or covered the ark. We don't know exactly what the material was, hence the difficulty in translation, so they just threw the word pitch in there. But the other 16 times that this word kopher is used in the Old Testament is never translated as pitch. So it appears that there was no real hydrocarbon or oil product used on the ark. It was some other type of covering, maybe a tree resin, something in that order, but it wasn't oil. So it appears that the oil was formed in the flood. The truth of the pre-flood oil, then, is that the kopher is a covering. There really was no basis for it being a hydrocarbon. We're going to look at two fables today in the remaining time. One, that oil forms slowly. That's what we're taught all the time in school. And secondly, the oil can survive for millions of years. What you put in your car, in your brand new cars, is supposedly, according to secular scientists, millions of years old. Maybe 100 million years old. But let's look at those and see what's really the truth. The first fable we're going to look at is the oil forms slowly. We're taught that over time, marine sediments, rocks out in the ocean, are formed as they're slowly deposited inch by inch by inch over thousands of years, millions of years, and then somehow magically almost become compacted and become oil. And then now, millions of years later, according to the secular scientists, we're able to drill for these oil deposits and actually produce the oil and then make that into gasoline and kerosene and diesel and all these different oil products that we use. But that's just a fable. Deposition is actually very rapid. And the latest studies have shown that clay, which is thought to take thousands of years to just get a few inches, which is what we're taught in school, that slow clay deposition builds up and builds up and builds up. Might take 1,000 years to get the thickness of a dime in the deep ocean. But in reality, oil deposits are laid down quickly. The latest finding is showing that from Indiana University's Flume Lab, that persistent currents are needed to deposit clay. And most clay deposits most of our oil. And we have huge clay deposits that run from Ohio all the way to Kentucky, 370 miles long. And most of the oils that we test today and produce are actually, when we test the clays, we see the exact same fingerprints. So we know that there's a source to these. Most of the oil appears to come from marine algae, things buried in a ocean environment, just like we saw in the flood. So the flood provides the marine algae, the flood provides the sedimentation that gives us these large, extensive shales across the continent. And the real science, the new studies in the last 10 years have shown that clay is not deposited slowly, clay is deposited quickly and forming these laminated layers. And the laminated layers have to form in feet per second, deposits of feet per second as the water was moving and transporting along. And there shouldn't even be laminated shales. These laminated shales are the really fine lines in the shales that you see. If you ever look at a rock layer, the shales are really, really fine layers. Well, bioturbation, or animals living in these environments, should be stirring those up. Bioturbation can destroy primary sedimentary structures such as lamination and create mottled bedding, so there shouldn't be any sedimentation layers at all.
When we return, we'll hear some final words from Dr. Clary. Stay with us. From sharks to butterflies, bats to orangutans, we can't help but marvel at the stunning and amusing creatures God has made. If you and your kids enjoy learning about animals, then you'll love our book, Guide to Animals, with its beautiful full-color images and fascinating facts. Published by the Institute for Creation Research, Guide to Animals provides answers to many popular questions about the animal kingdom. How do chameleons change colors? How do jellyfish live without a brain? And what happened to the dinosaurs and other extinct animals? Guide to Animals shows how everything that can slither, crawl, soar, or swim displays the handiwork of God. Order your copy of Guide to Animals from the Institute for Creation Research by calling 800-628-7640 or visiting ICR.org. That's 800-628-7640 or visiting ICR.org. Welcome back to Science, Scripture, and Salvation. Here's Dr. Clary.
So you may be wondering, how is oil generated? If it's buried in the sediments and the rocks during the flood, where does it come from? Well, it comes from kerogen. Kerogen is part of those marine algae, those deposits from those little marine plankton floating around that were buried in the flood. And if you bury these rocks deep enough into the Earth's thermal heat, which we call cracking the oil, will actually start producing the oil itself. So you need to get the rocks down about 10,000 to 15,000 feet down deep in the earth, and slowly over time, but not too much time, only 100 or 200 years, you can generate tremendous amounts of oil. Our U.S. government research lab has taken marine algae in 2013 out in Washington State and has actually produced marine algae into oil in 60 minutes. So oil does not take that long to produce. It just has to have the right conditions. And one of those conditions seems to be that it has to be buried deep enough in the earth, around 10,000 to 15,000 feet deep, to produce the oil. And the flood provided all that as well, buried thousands of feet of sediment, deposited very, very quickly. So what does the Bible say? Again, we look back at Genesis 11:3, and we see that the oil was generated probably 200 years after the flood at the time of the Tower of Babel. And we see across the Middle East today, where the Tower of Babel likely was, we see lots of oil seeps still. Oil was seeping up from these deposits very quickly after the flood, and we still produce oil, and they still find oil seeps today across much of Iraq and Iran and the areas of the Middle East where they still produce a lot of oil as well. So the truth of oil formation is oil forms quickly within a few hundred years, probably even quicker, right after the flood. One of our fables, the oil forms slowly, we fracked that, so to speak. But let's look at, can oil survive for millions of years? That's what we're taught. Oil can be 100 million years old and you're still putting it in your car. But oil is a naturally occurring organic compound made of carbon and hydrogen atoms called a hydrocarbon. It's made from organic debris, organic deposits of plankton and other marine algae. So if oil is organic, it's going to have all these organic chains, aromatic compounds, paraffins, isoparaffins, naphthenes, all these same sorts of things that we see in living cells today. But oil is a soft tissue, just like dinosaur soft tissue. And dinosaur soft tissue cannot survive even a million years. So these organics, like oil, can't be even a million years old, or it would have broke down and biodegraded like we see oil spills at the surface. The BP oil spill, for example, pretty much disappeared within a couple years' time. Bacteria loves oil. In general, what the geologists assume, though, is they assume that oil becomes pasteurized somehow in the deep earth at 80 degrees Celsius. So something close to boiling. As a general view today, they say, among petroleum geoscientists, the biodegradation ceases at 75 to 80 degrees Celsius in the zone of thermophilic organisms. This is from Nature in 2001. However, we can go to Yellowstone National Park and we can see lots of thermophilic bacteria. Bacteria survives in almost every environment. As deep as we've drilled, as deep as how waters can be, there's still bacteria living in them that thrive in those environments. So to say that oil is pasteurized is rather crazy. There is no place to pasteurize oil. The details and rates of process involved in crude oil degradation are still poorly understood, the geologists say in that same article in Nature in 2001. The problem with the oil is it breaks down very quickly, especially at the surface when there's more oxygen. It'll break down to within 7 days. And about 70% of the world's oil is biodegraded that we're producing. So we know biodegradation takes place in the subsurface. There is no place to pasteurize oil. If you did pasteurize the oil, groundwater would percolate through and bring in new bacteria from somewhere else. So there really is no way to pasteurize oil and keep it pasteurized. You can't isolate the oil from its surroundings. So the truth of oil preservation is that it is an organic compound, just like dinosaur soft tissue. It degrades quickly, and there is really no such thing as pasteurization. You can pasteurize it maybe for a few years, but it's going to quickly percolate. Water will come back in, bringing new bacteria in. And bacteria thrives on oil. It loves to eat oil, and that's why the oil spills at the surface disappear so quickly in the Gulf of Mexico and even in Alaska, especially the warmer the water. So we've fracked these couple of fables. The oil forms quickly. That's the real truth. Oil does not take millions of years to form. It is not deposited in slow deposition. It's deposited in rapid deposition in order to preserve the laminations, in order to preserve the organic compounds. You have to bury things very, very quickly. Oil cannot survive for millions of years. If it's an organic compound, organic compounds have a shelf life. They have a half-life, if you want to call it that. They actually break down by bacteria. And there's no way to pasteurize the oil for millions of years because you're always bringing new groundwater in from somewhere else. So the Bible, once again, was right all along. Oil forms after the flood, percolated up, and the people at the Tower of Babel were able to use this as part of their mortar for building the Tower of Babel. But before the flood, there was no oil. Even though the Bible mentions the word pitch, that is the Hebrew word kofir. It was very unlikely that was the same type of oil referred to a few chapters later when you get to the Tower of Babel.
Nagapangita ug dalangpan apan dito sa imong krus. Ako nakaplagan ang gugmang nga walay sukod, walay bayad. Gikuptan ko nimo bisan wa ko midoon. Gipili ko nimo bisan puno ko sa sala. Gihugasan mo ako sa dugo mong balaan. Jesus, ikaw ang aking kabaguhan. Gibago mo ako gikan sa kangit-ngit ngadto sa kahayag. Gitawag mo ako gikan sa kamatayon ngadto sa kinabuhi. Karon magakanta ko sa imong ngalan, magadaig ko hangtod sa hangtod. Ginoo, gibago mo ako. Wala na'y kahadlok, wala na'y pagduha-duha. Kay ikaw nagapuyo sa sulod nako, bisan pa sa unos ako mosalig. Ikaw ang akong lig-on nga bato. Gikuptan ko
Ito ang